there's one phenomenon called decision fatigue. That just making a decision depletes your willpower. So the more decisions you make, the harder it is to make decisions.
So we have a limited willpower.
Yes, we do. It's like a muscle that you can strengthen it with exercise and practice, but as you use it, it gets tired.
Wow. I'm here with John Tierney.
Yes, that's right.
And we are going to talk about willpower and also about the power of back, another one of his book. But willpower is one very important topic in my life because I do a lot of things that require willpower. And I think I got the hang of this, but I wanted to talk about this so I can explore more about this. So tell me about willpower. How do we develop it? How did you come to write about it? And yeah, tell me all about this.
No, it's the book Willpower also, it's got a chapter with someone like you, David Blaine, and I went and watched him do some of his feats and trying to understand how he manages to do this. And I know you're going to try and break his record, right? I think.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be more days buried alive than
Boy,
he was.
I can't imagine doing that. I salute your willpower for that. Well, I got started on this because. And you're right, this is a really important topic. I mean, Willpower was a bestseller. It's been translated into like 24 languages, so, and when you ask people around the world, what virtue would you like to have most? And what's your biggest flaw? What do you want more of? Do you want to have more intelligence, more ambition, more whatever? The number one thing people say is, I wish I had more willpower, because it takes willpower to do anything.
Me too.
Well, everybody thinks they don't have enough. And so I wrote this book with a very prominent, just a brilliant social psychologist named Baumeister. And he discovered this very important thing called basically called ego depletion, and what he found was he did a pretty famous experiment where he had students come into a laboratory and they would sit there, and as they were sitting there, they would smell these delicious chocolate chip cookies being cooked. They'd just been cooked, they could smell it. And then they were told, and then they would go into another room and they would say that this was an experiment and that they were being put in, and there was a plate of these new freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, and there was also a plate of radishes.
What radishes?
Radishes are these really tasteless kind of vegetables.
Okay.
They're really not very good at all. And they would have these two plates there. And they would tell the students, you are in the radish condition, and that means that you can eat as many radishes as you want, but you can't have the cookies. And then the student would just sit there alone in the room, and the researchers were watching secretly, and they would get up and they'd look at the chocolate chip cookies. They'd want it, but most of them managed. They sometimes would even pick them up and they'd look at it, but they could only eat the radishes. So they had to exercise self-control for a little bit. Then they gave them some other tests to see, and they found that the students who had to exercise all that self-control, all that willpower not to eat the chocolate chip cookies, they did significantly worse at self-control in other tasks.
The people that ate the cookies?
No, the people that did not eat the cookies, they resisted temptation. They did not eat it. But they discovered that depleted their willpower. They had less willpower left for other tasks that require willpower.
Like for the day.
Well, they would immediately test them there, but they found they had less willpower. And this was this is called ego depletion. That you're using up your willpower. So
we have a limited willpower.
Yes, we do. It's like a muscle that you can strengthen it with exercise and practice, but as you use it, it gets more tired. It gets tired.
Wow.
And so, for instance, writing about David Blaine, he's somebody, and you do this also. You build up your willpower. You build up that muscle, but the more you do it, but as you use that muscle, it gets tired. It gets fatigued. And this thing, it comes in all kinds of ways. There's one phenomenon called decision fatigue, that just making a decision depletes your willpower. So And so people and so the more decisions you make, the harder it is to make decisions. And
Yes.
there's a famous study of judges when they would have to decide whether someone who was in prison was coming before the parole board and they would decide
What parole board
the
means?
parole board is does he stay in prison or does he go on parole? Do we
Okay.
release him from prison early on parole? And they found that when they came in first thing in the morning, a prisoner was more likely to get paroled, because it's a hard decision to let the easy decision is say, no, keep him in prison, because I don't get in trouble. If he goes out and commits a crime, that's no problem. But it's a harder decision to say, let's do it. But they found that the prisoners who early in the morning, when the judges were fresh, it was easier for them to make a hard decision. But then as the day wore on, they would just start saying, no.
That's
They didn't want to decide. And then the really interesting thing was that they found that they would have a break and the judges would get some food, a snack. And there was also a lunch break. And right after they had some food, they were able to make decisions again. And this is another of the discoveries that, that this muscle depends.
So that says a lot about free will.
well, you need energy. And when you get this, the energy in food, that gives you a burst of new energy and you have more willpower. And that's why, dieting, people always think of dieting as do you have good willpower? Can you resist eating? And it's the classic example of willpower, but it's also the hardest thing to do, really. It's the most difficult form of self-control.
Yes.
Because if you don't eat, you don't have energy and you have less willpower. So it's it's very difficult. So it's very difficult.
So, but I think we all agree that we need more willpower, and like this is an important topic. But let's talk about what you found, how to acquire this skill and how to trick yourself to get more willpower, or how David Blaine got more willpower. Teach us how we can improve our willpower.
Well, one thing, they did experiments where they would have students, they tried different ways to improve people's willpower. And one thing they did, it sounds very simple. They would tell these students in the experiment, go home and for the next 2 weeks, just whenever you can, sit up straight. Don't slouch. Just do that. It seems like a simple little thing to do. And they found when they came back 2 weeks later that these students actually did better on self-control tasks. They would do experiments like how long can you hold your hand in ice cold water, or how long can you squeeze one of those grips? That takes takes willpower to do that. And they found that they improved it. They had built up that muscle. And that was how David Blaine, and that's how you do it. You keep, the more you do this, the more you build up that willpower. But the simplest way, there are very interesting studies where they looked at, there were some done in Germany where they looked at people who had the most self-control, who were very, very good self-control in their lives. And they followed what they did and they tracked them all day long, and they would, ask them what they're doing and how they did it. And they found that these people, their secret to self-control was that they didn't make themselves have to use it very often. They basically structured their lives.
The mic.
Exactly. They structured their lives so they didn't have to use it. So, they wouldn't keep ice cream in their freezer, so they don't have to resist that temptation. They didn't walk down the aisle in the supermarket with all the cookies and the potato chips. And so they did that. And there's a way. There's also called outsourcing self-control. For instance, it's hard to make yourself go out and jog or exercise. But if you schedule it with somebody else, or you go to a gym or you have a personal trainer, then you have to do it so you don't have to make yourself. Someone else is doing it.
Can I give you one example of this? It's been now 3 years, I think, that I'm exercising every other day, and I never failed to exercise. Really? And that is exactly what you're saying. It's not that I don't have a choice. I want to keep my track record. I don't choose to go and exercise. It's like it's just happening, and it's not like I need motivation. I can't not go.
Well, but that's a tribute to your self-control that you do. But that's a great way to do it. One thing, the basic steps in self-control are that you have to set a clear goal, and then you monitor your progress.
There is a phone ringing, but
do you want me to start?
No, it's not a problem.
Okay.
The people will have fun watching this segment.
So you have to set a goal, and then you have to monitor your progress. Because
so what do you mean by monitoring your progress?
I mean,
exactly?
for instance, for you, I don't know if you write it down or not, but you know that every other day I have to do that, and you have in your head is I have to do this every day, and you'll remember. Now, other ways to do it are, that you have a to-do list, and you have to check things off every day. So, and you have these very clear things you have to check off.
Yes, because it's very easy to forget to do things. So
right. No, getting things done. Have you heard of a book by David Allen? It's a great little book, a big best-selling book called Getting Things Done, and he has a lot of these tricks for basically for getting things done. And one of the, he has a thing like the 2-minute rule that if there's a task you have to do and something comes up, if you can do it in less than 2 minutes, just do it right away and get it out of your system, and do it. But otherwise, you've got to keep a list of things, and you just got to monitor and see at the end of every week, did I do this? Did I do that? And I mean, a simple thing for weight control, there have been studies. If you simply weigh yourself every day and force yourself to look at that number, you're monitoring your weight. That makes a difference. Just that simple act of doing it.
So I guess writing this book helped you to your personal life, right?
It did. No, I mean, it certainly made me, there's an interesting thing called the Zeigarnik effect and this was discovered by, there were some psychologists in Europe, and they all went out to lunch at a restaurant, and the waiter took all their orders, and he didn't write anything down at all. He remembered everything. It was a big group, and they were very impressed. Well, after lunch, one of them had forgotten something. So the waiter went back, and the person went back and saw the waiter and said, and he said, well, of course he'll remember me and everything. And the waiter looked at her and had no idea who she was, didn't remember anything at all. And he said, well, how did you remember all those meals? And he said, I remember it, and then as soon as I deliver it, it's out of my mind. He clears his memory. And that's, and the psychologist was named Zeigarnik who did it, and that's called the Zeigarnik effect. And my co-author, Roy Baumeister, in our book Willpower, we talk about experiments he did about this. And the lesson of that is that an unfinished task lingers in your mind, and it gets in the way of other things.
Yes.
And so if you so if there's something that you're doing it, David Allen likes to say that if you want to find God but you need cat food for your cat, get the cat food first. You've got to get these things out of your mind.
Tell me about David Blaine experience when you met him, because he's one of my heroes. So what did you learn about his willpower personally? Well, how he does all these things.
I went down to the Cayman Islands when he was training to hold his breath.
How many years ago?
I can't remember. It was 10 years ago. No, longer than 10, 15. Maybe 2008 when he was on Oprah. I can't recall.
Okay.
But he was training to go on the Oprah show and hold his breath underwater for 18 minutes. And he was training.
What a willpower you need to do that.
Exactly. Well, I watched him. It was interesting because we went down to the Cayman Islands where he was training, and he was doing it in the ocean and also in a pool. And it's amazing how you can, train yourself. I mean, his trainer taught me in half an hour. I held my breath for 3 minutes and 41 seconds underwater. Oh, wow. I never imagined I could do it. And the trick is you have to completely relax. You just don't move any muscles. You don't use any oxygen. Or use very little. And I watched him do it in the pool for 16 minutes. He stopped just short of world record because he wanted to break the world record on the Oprah show.
Really?
Yes.
So you watched him doing that for 16 minutes?
Yeah, he was just in the pool and he got ice. He said, no problem at all. I never even felt any pain. He had really done it. But then what happened when he went on the Oprah show, and you know, they monitored him in the pool and his pulse rate would just go way, way down. He was completely relaxed. But in the Oprah show, when he went on, he's on national television, you know, the world's watching. His pulse rate did not go down the way it had in the swimming pool. And, you know, and
so you were watching that as well.
Yes, and he said afterwards it was one of the most painful things he ever went through. He said it was just killing him because, you know, his pulse was too high, so it really was hurting him. And he just held on. He managed to hold on, but he said it was like getting just the worst, just getting kicked in the stomach. It was just horrible. But he managed to hold on, and his secret was that he had built up his willpower muscle. You know, he'd done all these years. And he started as a young kid doing all these things. He'd deny himself, force him to do it. And, you know, in the book, Willpower, we also talk about Henry Morton Stanley, the explorer who went across Africa. And the stuff that he went through was just astonishing, the suffering, you know, getting the bugs, the heat, the getting, you know, arrows shot at them the whole time. They were hungry, they had malaria, they had everything. And Stanley was someone who, like David Blaine, as a young boy, he would like make himself do without a meal. He would not eat, you know, food. He just built up that willpower muscle, you know. So now, I mean, so it's good, and so you can do these exercises yourself to do it, but but as I say, it's easier if you don't have to keep forcing yourself to do it. If there's mental tricks, and like you talked about, one thing is to make something a rule, make it a habit, so you don't actually think, you just do it. Whenever like if you're going to eat ice cream, you can only do it at the kitchen table. You can't do it watching television. And like for you, it's I have to do this every other day, and you just think about that. And once something becomes a rule, that it gets easier to follow. And as a writer, one of my favorite rules is from Raymond Chandler, who wrote famous detective stories like The Big Sleep that have been turned into movies. And he had a very simple rule for writing. He would set aside 4 hours, in the morning. He would sit down, and he said he only had 2 rules. He said, number 1, you don't have to write. Number 2, you can't do anything else. So that you can't read, you can't write letters, you can't do it.
So he trapped himself.
Well, he said basically you get bored enough that you do it, and just avoiding all those things. And so, and he kind of removed the temptation, with that rule to do it. And so people who can, if you can set up a rule and then keep track of your progress. And another, important thing to do is reward yourself. When you set a goal, and if you meet it, really give yourself a nice reward. You should celebrate it.
I'm skeptical about that reward system because then sometimes you don't do it for the actual joyness of the task, and you do it for the reward. And it's like maybe the next time, like when we give a child $5 if they help a homeless person or something like that, we teach them that the act of kindness was not good enough for the joy, and the reward is the $5. So I'm confused about this reward system, but I'm curious to hear.
That's a good example. You say that you want people to do things because they are, but I think, for instance, for you doing your exercise routine, maybe you like exercise, most people find doing it sort of a pain. And I think you should be, reward yourself for doing it. And it makes you want to do it. I think in general, just, and also, having penalties too. The topic, what you say about rewards, the topic of the next book that I did with Roy Baumeister about the power of bad. One of the big topics we have in that is about penalties and rewards. And the penalties work much better than rewards.
Tell me about it.
Okay. Well, the power of bad, the subtitle is how the negativity effect rules us and how we can rule it. And the negativity effect is something that my co-author, Roy Baumeister, discovered. And he... psychologists had noticed, and economists had noticed also that in the 1980s that people cared more about losing money than making money. You know, that when they gave people choices, losing $1 hurt them much more than making $1. In fact, a lot of people would not make a bet unless they would get at least twice as much for it in return. They didn't want to risk the downside. And psychologists had noticed that a few things like that: a good first impression matters much less than a bad impression. You know, that if you make a good impression, it makes a little bit of impact, but it's easy enough to overcome that. But a bad first impression, really, it's very hard to get over that. So Roy looked through all the literature in psychology and sociology, economic, and he wanted to find an example. Well, when is a good thing stronger than a bad thing? When does it make more difference? And he was surprised to find out he couldn't find any example.
Oh,
wherever he looked, bad was. So he wrote a very famous paper called "Bad is Stronger Than Good," and they just found in everything you talk about, in emotions, bad emotions are more powerful, bad events are more powerful. You know, we talk about a trauma. After something bad happens to you, you can suffer a trauma that will stay with you for life. Now, there's no opposite. There's no good event there's no word to say something good happened to me and it stayed with me my whole life. There's no opposite of the word trauma.
Yes.
So Roy and I wrote this book, The Power of Bad, to talk about this negativity effect. And it's easy to understand why we have this, because it's
evolution.
Yes, exactly. It helped our ancestors survive. It's much more important to pay attention to a threat. It's more important to pay attention to a berry that will poison you than to really enjoy a really good berry. You know, you have to worry more. The people who didn't pay attention to lions and dangerous animals are the ones who didn't survive. So you want to be very alert to threats.
How we can use that to kind of help our lives? Like, you should try to not make bad stuff to other people, or we should not make good things, and just put effort on trying to avoid the bad. Like, how we can help our lives with this?
Right. Well, we talk about something, and we talk about a lot of the research in it, and we come up with a rough rule that when you look at things about money, about how much losing $1 matters versus gaining $1, or if you talk about, is somebody depressed, one way to do it is, how many good days do you have for every bad day? And if you have one good day and one bad day, say in a relationship. In fact, when Roy was a young man, he had a romantic partner who, he loved her, and they had wonderful times together. But she also just had this terrible temper, and there would be some really horrible days, and he couldn't. And on the good days, he was madly in love with her. On the other days, he wanted to get out, and he didn't know how to, reconcile. What do I do? And so he started just a very crude thing. He started just at the end of every day, he would write down, was this a good day or was this a bad day? And he noticed after about 6 months that the ratio was staying pretty much the same. There were 2 good days for every bad day. And he kind of realized that's not good enough. You have to, and you see these things that in general, bad things, and this isn't a law of nature, but it's a rough guide, that generally bad things are about 3 times as strong as good things. So you want to have more than 3 good things for every bad thing. So you
want one bad thing, you need 3 good things.
Well, we say to be safe 4. 4. So you come out ahead. So we call it the rule of 4. That you want to have, so. If you're late one time for a meeting, don't think that showing up early the next time will make it up. You've got to do it a lot.
I think this is a great rule, because when I was as well in a relationship, it's very difficult to identify if it's a healthy relationship or unhealthy relationship when you are in the relationship. So just having this as a rule, it's like, is how many bad things and you don't want half bad, or you want to have a lot more positive. So and And it got me a lot of time to understand that I was kind of in a toxic relationship. And I was like, oh my God, I can't be, when I got out of it, oh my God, I can't believe how, but if I knew this rule, I was going to be able maybe to kind of understand that what is the right balance. But we don't know what's the right balance. Maybe one person will say, oh, if it just the good outweigh the negative, then it's not good enough.
Yeah, right. The good has to be a lot. There has to be a lot more good. There have been a bunch of studies by people who track couples, and one very simple measure is.
By the way, it's very funny because your wife is Helen Fisher, that we had the previous podcast, and she told me in the podcast to interview you. So we have on the record that she said, your next podcast will be with my husband, and this is what we're doing now.
Well, that's a good thing. She is brilliant. She really is. And no, and we don't. One of the ways the people who study couples do is they just ask how often do you have sex versus how often do you fight? What's the ratio of sex to fighting? And there are some couples that don't have very much sex, but they don't fight either. And there are some couples that have sex more often, but they also fight a lot. And it isn't so much how much sex you have, but it's the ratio of good to bad. And that if it's one sex for every fight, that's you're not even. That's a bad sign. You want to have a lot more good than bad.
So you don't need 4 sex.
As a rough guide, I think you want that. And as you say also that, because bad is so much stronger, one of the first easiest things to do is just try to minimize the bad. Most of us, tend to think, and in the book, The Power of Bad, we talk about in novels, these couples who think, I do all these good things for you. But they don't realize what's really important is avoiding the bad.
Drop the mic. Yes.
That you can do good things, but it's really the bad stuff that will get you immediately. Just cut out the bad stuff.
Also with your team at work as well, the same thing. And you can do a lot of good things for them, but like one bad thing can be so meaningful, for them.
They don't forget. People don't forget it. And another thing, we have a chapter in the book, in The Power of Bad, about bad apples in the workplace. And there have been really interesting experiments that, they have to have a team of workers get together. 4 people had to work on a project, and they trained, and they had, somebody working, a confederate of the researcher who was an actor, and he would join the group, and they would have him be a bad apple and be basically a jerk, and he would act. Sometimes he was just he was just a real jerk, where he'd say obnoxious things to people, like this was a group of business students.
But this was scheduled for him to do all this stuff.
Yeah, it was to do this, and then they watched, and sometimes he would be a jerk, these were business students, and they were supposed to come up with an idea for a new company, and somebody would have an idea, and he would go, "Is this your first business course?" He would just say something really like, "I can't believe it." You go, "Are you serious?" And then sometimes he would be a slacker. That's another kind of a bad apple, where he just kind of lay back and he would just take out his phone. He wouldn't contribute at all. And then sometimes he would just be really depressed. He'd be putting his head down on the desk. And he got himself in a mood for this he would try to imagine his cat had died. And he'd just be like this. And the really interesting thing that happened was that by the end of it, it was so contagious what he did, that once he started being a jerk to people, everyone started being a jerk to people, not just back to him. They would do it. And once he started slacking off, the other people would start slacking off. And so, what they found was that that having one bad person on your team would just sink the team, and they could not compensate even if you had
drop the mic again.
But even if you had one bad person, could not compensate. One star, one great worker could not compensate for one bad person.
Yeah,
and there's a book we talk about called the No Asshole Rule, which is basically when you're hiring people, we just don't want to. The important thing is don't hire bad people.
Yes, and I found that to be very, very, very true in my team, because I have a team of 7 people. And like when you hire one person, he might be good at his job, but when he's in a group and he's bad with other people, and it's like for exactly that reason that you are describing, is he might be the best in his work, but if he's bad with the other people and he create problems, then it's outweigh all the other good stuff that he does and makes him like net negative to the group. So.
Yeah, that is exactly true. And so people don't pay enough attention to it. And then if you make a mistake and you hire, somebody, who was wrong for the job, then you've got to get rid of them. I mean, but it's also important to do it. Don't do it in a bad way, because it was your mistake to hire them.
Yes,
it wasn't
true.
necessarily there. And so, because one thing, if you fire somebody in a nasty way, companies that suddenly really just, are really ruthless about it, that will be remembered by everybody else at that job about you. So you
and
should
that's
be
the bad thing that we're talking about. That's
everybody will remember how you treated that worker.
Yes.
So give them, to help them find a job, severance pay, whatever. You should be good about it, but you can't let them, because it'll just poison the whole atmosphere.
Yes,
so.
That's crazy. But tell me more about the power of bad in the world. Is the world bad? Is the world good? Is the world that we are living? What did you learn about the badness of the people?
We have our brains are just so wired to focus on the bad, and we think that the world is, people tend to think the world is getting worse because we're just, you see this, there's a war, there's this, there's that. And we have a chapter that I think, in fact, this chapter was written just before, the book was published just before the COVID pandemic, about 2 months before it. And the COVID pandemic is the perfect example of what happened. But we have a chapter called The Crisis. And the crisis is the fact that there's this whole industry that of the media, of some activists, of academics, that their whole business, we call them the merchants of bad. Their whole business is to tap into that primal part of your brain that responds to bad things and constantly emphasize the bad, constantly.
You are a journalist.
Yes,
your
I
whole
am.
life.
My business is terrible. It's built on it. The old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. That bad news is, the good news is no news. That all we care about is, because that's the easiest way to get people's attention. Something's bad happening. Something's bad going to happen to you. The world's terrible. And we instantly respond because our brains we have to be very alert to threats. And what we don't realize now is, as you said earlier, there's a good evolutionary reason for this. In the ancient savannah, the hunter, you had to pay attention to threats. But the world today is a very safe place. And
yes,
we have never had things so good. And, almost every long-term trend is getting better. People live longer. Last century, half the people in the world didn't get enough food. Now 90% do. Most people couldn't read. Now they do. People have so much, poverty has just plummeted around the world. And it's interesting when you when you turn on the news, you don't get this picture of the world. And I'm very afraid. I'm listening to a book now, and it talks about like how what we believe can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we believe that the world is bad, we are going to treat everyone that is bad. And that's, I believe, a huge problem, because whatever our beliefs are, we're going to become. Exactly. No, that's very, I know that you had Lenore Skenazy about the free-range kids, and there was one story about a child, who was abducted, and the media just, terrified. So parents are all terrified, and now they won't let their children walk to school. They won't do, and the kids are missing out on so much in life because they think the world is filled with all these people who want to abduct them. And it's crazy. For the crisis, we have, 3 guiding principles of it, which is, number one, the world will always seem to be in crisis.
Yes.
Number 2, the crisis is never as bad as it sounds. And number 3 is the solution could easily make things worse. Because what happens is, it happens over and over. Exactly. I mean, COVID was a real problem, but the news media, my fellow journalists, scared everybody into, this is the worst thing ever. It's going to kill everyone and nobody. And it was very clear early on that it was not really for healthy young people. This was not really a threat. But everybody was terrified, and we did all these things that hurt people, and they ended up, it's quite possible that the lockdowns and the school closures will end up costing more lives than COVID did. We had all these mental health issues. We had people, heart attacks, diabetes. People weren't getting treated. We just overreacted, and the solution made things so much worse. And it was great for the ratings of the TV networks and for the mainstream media. Everybody's
so
turning
much
on.
Money at that point.
Right, everybody was doing it and watching it and just terrifying themselves. And nobody ever put this in perspective and said, yes, if you're older, you should worry about this. If you're younger, it's not really, it's not something that's going to kill you. And it's like the flu for young people, mostly. I mean, there are special cases, but there is this whole industry, as we call them, the merchants of bad, who make a living scaring people about these things. And so you think everything, there's been, if you look at the last century, there's just been one scare after another. In the 1960s and 70s, there was the population crisis, where suddenly we were going to have mass starvation. Billions of people were supposed to starve to death because population was growing. It was completely false, but it led to some terrible things where women, millions of women were sterilized, and we can't let them have children. China adopted this one-child policy now, and now they have a shortage of workers.
Fucking stupid people of the world.
But I mean, in a way, you understand how people followed. I mean, I was amazed in the United States that everybody just submitted to, oh, sure, we'll lock down, we'll stay in our home, we'll close our schools, we won't go to church, we won't go to restaurants.
The most free country in the world.
And they just surrendered all these freedoms. But I mean, I'm disappointed in my fellow Americans, but also, they were being told by the government and by the mainstream media, this is the science, you have to do all this. And they trusted them. And I think one of the consequences of the pandemic is people, just do not trust the media, even less than before. I saw a statistic that when they survey people around the world and ask them how much trust do you have in the news media, that the lowest is in the United States. And I think it's something like 3/4 of people do not trust the media. And
so
they
75% of the people.
It's something like that, yeah. And they shouldn't. I mean, we got 2 years of lies on COVID. And I was railing against. I write for City Journal, the website and the magazine. And in City Journal, I was writing early on, the lockdowns, we have to balance. And there were good scientists who were saying, wait a minute, we can't just worry about one virus. We have to look at all of society. We have to look at the effect on children. We can't have children miss school. We have to think about the big picture. But everybody was just focused on that. And so, the one bit of good news I have on this, I think, is that social media, and podcasters like you, are a great alternative to the mainstream media. People complain about, social media is so negative, it's terrible. And of course, there's bad stuff that happens there. We know cancel culture and all that. But there's interesting research that we talk about in The Power of Bad, that when people share things on social media, some negative stuff gets shared quickly. but it's actually people are much more positive in sharing stuff than they are negative. And the positive stuff, like the hugs that you do and the Mr. Beast, these things really spread widely because, people, now the mainstream media, if you're trying to reach a mass audience, the easiest way to do that is to hit this primal part of the brain that's afraid. And everybody has the same fears. We're all afraid of dying. We're all afraid of this. But the good parts, people's desire for higher good things. Maybe you're interested in history, you're interested in science, you're interested in the arts. These tend to be more. They're individual. They're smaller niches. So on the web, you find all these great little groups that are discussing, Civil War history. They're discussing, modern art. They're discussing this, but it's not a But so the mainstream media though is always going for the mass audience. So the easiest thing is we scare them with bad stuff. But the rest of social media, people tend to share. People don't send, their friends pictures of a terrorist attack, a grisly picture or a child who was murdered. You send a picture of, oh, isn't this a cool video? Isn't this beautiful?
It's a mix of both.
Oh, it's definitely a mix. It's definitely a mix.
And I think because my job is to create all these viral videos, I think if I was going to use the bad method, like, whatever, I pranked this girl and like she cried and like this and she started punching me later or whatever the thing. If I used this method to hook people, to bring them in my video, I think it's a lot more easier and I was going to be probably a lot more successful in views. But I think but I didn't try it because I don't want to do that. But this is what Chris Anderson was talking about as well. That he believes that with Mr. Beast, that because his theme is to give money and to be good and kind to people, he has faith in humanity because we see who is the biggest YouTuber in the world, so whatever he does is kind of a reflection of what people like.
Right.
So I think that's optimistic.
Right. No, and I think in The Power of Bad, we discussed some of the research where they've tried to balance this, and there is evidence that bad stuff. I mean, if you do something really bad or a really mean prank, that may get an instant reaction, and it will spread some. But the research we cite in the book, it shows that over the long haul, the positive stuff tends to spread more.
Maybe short-term thing than negativity.
Thing, right. It's a very easy way to get a quick hit. Yes. But if you want to really develop a lasting audience, then, and I mean, and on the larger scale, I mean, the good news in the world is, as I've said, every positive trend, virtually every trend in the world is getting better. The air is cleaner, climate change is a problem, but again, people have said, "Oh, it's the end of the world." We're not gonna. And I mean, the temperature getting warmer a couple of degrees. We've survived a lot worse.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't want to get into that debate, but
I might want to later. But because this is an interesting perspective that you have, and also I know that you have a famous article about masks.
Yes.
And I'm curious for you to tell me more about that, and later we can dive into recycling as well and all the fun stuff.
Well, I guess on this good-bad theme, I'd say that in general, most trends are positive. If you look, people live longer, they're healthier, they're wealthier, that. And that's because a lot more good things happen every day than bad things. And, we don't see them on the news, but there are all these good things happening. And I think over the long haul, I'm confident that will keep going.
So you are confident about the future?
I'm hopeful about the future. Yes. I think there are some institutions that these merchants of bad, they want to stay in business and they'll keep trying to scare us. But I think as people get more and more choices and we get smarter about, how to use social media, how to do things during the pandemic, for instance, if you watch the mainstream media, it was nothing but, here's how many people died today of COVID. You've got to wear a mask. You've got to stay home. You've got to lock down. Don't let your kids go to school. All this. But if you looked at the web, at places like City Journal, where I write, but there were new websites like the Daily Skeptic that came up that were saying, wait a minute, let's actually talk to some real scientists and see what they say. And there were these scientists, the great Barrington scientist, who suddenly got huge followings on Twitter by saying, wait a minute, let's look at the research. That before COVID, before the pandemic, the plans were, the world's leading experts had said, even if we had a pandemic as bad as the 1918 Spanish flu, we shouldn't lock down, we shouldn't wear masks, because there's no evidence those things work. And you could find that on the web. And I think more and more people are going to, we just have to be careful. And one of the lessons in the book, in The Power of Bad, we talk about is you have to curate your news feed, that you should try to set it up so the people you follow send positive things rather than negative things. Don't get bogged down.
It's like we said in the willpower thing, you kind of put because you don't want to make choices every day, and
yes,
so set it up with follow the more
positive
stuff, and so you don't need to make those decisions in the future, and you just consume the better stuff, and you can course correct it over time and improve it.
No, it's really, mass media, when you watch the the news channels, Fox or MSNBC, these things, they make a living, but it's always, can you believe what the other side did? Can you believe how stupid, how evil they are? And they do go back and forth, and they get an audience, but and it's worth knowing what's going on some, but if you just spend your day thinking, oh, they're all so awful, they're all so crazy, the other side, the world's going to hell. But most people are not, for all the, the worries we have about things are getting so extreme, so polarized. Well, and we talk about this in The Power of Bad, that there is polarization, political polarization, but it's really among the elites. It's among, it's among journalists, politicians. It's among these elite people that you see on the cable news channels. And the average voter in the United States hasn't really changed that much. People still have moderate views on most things, but they just keep seeing the extremes, and they think things are worse than they really are.
Yeah, and what you consume, this is what the perception of the world that you have.
Right.
So
right,
it's scary. Hopefully, we can find more ways to are you optimistic about Elon Musk with Twitter, buying it Twitter, and maybe what do you think about that whole thing?
It's great. I think it's great that you want to have encouraging things. The censorship is really bad. During the pandemic, I wrote an article about the harms of masking. There's all this evidence, dozens of studies. It's not good for kids. It's bad psychologically, socially. There's some medical problems, something called mask-induced exhaustion syndrome. It's obviously not healthy to do it. And I just pointed out we have to consider this. And plus there was no evidence. And I wrote again recently that, there's the latest evidence is they made no difference. But when I wrote that, Facebook, censored the article. They labeled it. They said this is partly false, and there was nothing at all false that I wrote. I was citing peer-reviewed research, but they had this group that was just saying, no, you can't say anything different from the party line on this, and that was happening. And I think it's great and Twitter was doing that kind of thing where, the scientists who were questioning lockdowns and saying, well, what's the they were getting, censored on Twitter in one way or another.
It's when you have all these media censoring and putting all these things, they don't let the word and the people do they don't let the debate play.
I know.
And they play a big role in these things because they are our world now.
Right.
So when they say, "Oh no," to this, to your article, or to this thing, it's So I don't know. I don't know about Elon Musk buying Twitter. I'm very optimistic as well, but it's a difficult problem to solve.
It is a problem because those platforms are they're sort of monopolies in a way. But I also, I think one good thing about freedom and free market system is that if you start really, Facebook's already losing, it's been losing market share to other platforms. As long as we allow free competition, as long as, we have different things, then the government can censor things. But I think in the marketplace, eventually, it's just not a very good strategy, that if you start censoring a lot, people will go elsewhere. And the mainstream media has been, I mean, they've been losing a huge share of the audience. You know, people don't trust them, and so they go elsewhere. And so I think that's why I guess I'm optimistic over the long haul.
Do you think the government should intervene with censor stuff or?
No, I mean, certainly the government and people, you know, it's come out with Twitter that the government was pressuring Twitter to do that. And that's clearly wrong. I mean, and that's, you know, that violates the First Amendment. And I think that should certainly stop. And the people who did it should be punished. As far as the government trying to regulate it, there might be some things that could be done to do it, but I'm very skeptical. I mean, again, it's the rule of the crisis. You know, the solution could easily make things worse. And whenever the government gets involved,
I will always remember this: the solution can always make things worse. So it's crazy if you think about it. Like, the solution can be even worse than the actual problem.
Well, what happens all the time. We just constantly, you know, during the energy crisis of the 1970s, you know, because everybody thought, oh, we're not going to have any oil anymore. We're going to run out. And people have been saying this for like, you know, hundreds of years. Oh, we're going to run out of energy. And we never do. But they did some of these things, and then people also got the big scare about, oh, nuclear power is so dangerous, we have to do it. So as a result of those overreactions, because they thought that we're running out of natural gas, they basically, in the United States, they stopped utilities from using natural gas, and they made them use coal. So that made global warming worse because there's more carbon. And by shutting down nuclear plants and you know, now, I mean, that's a way, you know, that's made global warming worse too. So we overreacted to one problem and we made another problem worse.
So what do you think about this? Do you think it's as big as you don't think it's as big of a problem, this energy thing that and the renewable energy and all these scarcity that we have about the climate the climate will warm up and we're going to have problems. What do you think about this? You don't think it's as big as a problem as this projected?
I mean, this rule of the crisis, it's never as bad as it seems, because you have the merchants of bad, you have the media, and you have activists who are always going to exaggerate the problem. Now, I mean, you know, the greenhouse effect is real. The climate has been warming. And you know, so I don't deny it's happening, and I think it's something that we should worry about. You know, we should think about and do research about and look for ways. I mean, the obvious solution right now is we should have more nuclear power because you're not putting carbon in the atmosphere. And it's ironic that so many of the people who claim...
What do you mean you are not... So how does nuclear power helps the environment exactly?
Because it's not putting carbon into the atmosphere. You're not burning oil. You're not burning fossil fuels. You're, you know, it's really it's the only way at the moment, the only practical way to generate reliable, large amounts of power. And I mean, you know, it's possible with solar power. There'll be some advances that it will work better. But right now, solar power and windmills are just, I mean, it's fine if people want to use them, but they're not very reliable. They're expensive. They have their own environmental problems. You know, you cover the landscape with windmills. Do you really want to do that to a natural landscape? So many of the solutions there to try and do this are not, you know, are making things worse, and they're not really addressing the problem. So, and I think that, you know, the idea that we have to start banning cars with gasoline and this, it's just an overreaction to it. And I mean, I think it's really, you know, the last I checked, there are almost 1 billion people in the world, mostly in Africa, that don't have electricity. And to me, to say we're going to ban fossil fuels with the, you know, and it's basically telling these people, well, you know, we use fossil fuels to get rich, but you don't get it. You know, you can have a windmill. It's just, I think that's immoral. So, I mean, I think.
So how does that plays out to Africa? Because we provide them the resources, right? How can you explain maybe the problem with Africa? Because I don't understand. So 1 billion people, they don't have electricity.
Yes.
And what does that have to do with what you were talking about?
Because the West, the World Bank, and the United States are pressuring all these countries. We don't want you to, to use fossil fuels, and we don't want you to use. There have been people, some terrible examples of food shortages because we don't want you to use fertilizer. We don't want you to use this, the stuff that that we all use to get food and to become rich. But we don't. But we want you to be sustainable. But it's the sustainable stuff it tends to be much more expensive and it has other problems and I think it's irresponsible.
And you need to get to a point that you make to be sustainable and improve, and then you can use the renewable energies or all this stuff and like focus on that. But this is what you're pointed out, that the United States is like so fortunate with all this stuff, and now they can transition because they have all the money and they're rich. But all the other countries, is difficult for them to do that. So to force them to do it might create more problems.
Oh, it does. It means people
problems that the solution can bring more problems.
Yes. Well, no, you have people who won't have electricity. That they won't have vehicles to get to the hospital. They won't. The best, anti-poverty measure, the best thing for anyone's health is to become rich. Then you can afford doctors, medicine, healthy food, healthy air, all this stuff. But you have to become rich to do that. And the way that we did it in the West was through fossil fuels. And I at some point, I think fossil fuels will be, will phase out. We may be having nuclear energy or something else, but to say we're going to suddenly stop this is just, I think it's great. And it's completely impractical. California, they're talking about banning all cars with gasoline and making everyone drive electric cars. They don't have enough electricity now. They're having brownouts. They can't even, where are all these cars going to get their electricity? From windmills? I don't think so. So, and it's been crazy that we've been shutting nuclear plants when we need that electricity. So, I just think you have to be practical about this. And so much of, there's always been this sort of hysteria on environmentalism. Everybody wants a cleaner environment. We all want clean air. We want to preserve wildlife. And, there's the trends there are really good. We have, the amount of forests in the world has been getting bigger, growing.
Really?
Yes, because farmers are so efficient. United States has much more forest land, much more natural land than it used to have. When you drive up and down the East Coast here, you see all these forests. That all used to be farmland, but we don't need it anymore because our farmers produce so much food on so little land that they do it. And that's happening in the rest of the world. In fact, people say that we're probably right now at what they call peak farmland. That from now on, the amount of farmland in the world is going to be decreasing.
Oh, that's
even though we'll be eating more food, but it'll come from more efficient farms.
So I love all your ideas because they are a bit kind of radical to what they present like a very different view that what is normal. And like one similar idea that you have is about recycling. That it's bad to do recycling, right?
Well, it's a waste. It's very wasteful, recycling, it's a solution in search of a problem. The article that I wrote for the New York Times in 1996, and it set a record for hate mail at the New York Times. It was the cover story of the magazine. I could show it to you. It's called "Recycling is Garbage," and and I just looked at the facts about recycling, and the whole movement began in the 1980s because there was one garbage barge. I don't know if you know the history of this or not, but there was one garbage barge that from a town on Long Island near here, and they wanted to ship their garbage to a dump down somewhere else, and the place wouldn't take it, and it became a big media thing. Like nobody wanted to take this garbage. And so suddenly it became this thing, we're running out of places to bury our garbage. We're all going to be buried in garbage. And there was also this idea that we're running out of everything. We're going to run out of metals. We're going to run out of oil. We're going to run out of this. And, we have to save all this. And these things kind of make intuitive sense. Well, yeah, well, I guess we're going to run out of copper, right? There's only so much copper in the ground, and the population is getting bigger. But our intuition is wrong. That if you look at the long history of oil and energy and everything, and you go back thousands of years, and in the last few centuries, it's very clear. We don't run out of things because we get so much better at finding new supplies and at finding substitutes. So that's why the price of energy, people used to have to work. There's some famous charts that that if you wanted to have 1 hour of light from a candle or from oil in the past, the typical worker had to work. I remember he had to work many hours to do that, or maybe even weeks at some point. Today, if you want 1 hour of light at night, it's like a fraction of a second it takes to to pay for that for a typical worker, because we keep finding new ways to do things. So we're not running out of these materials. I wrote an article for the New York Times about a famous bet that this ecologist Julian Simon he made in 1980, and he said, if you think we're running out of anything at all, energy, anything, you pick anything you want. And any date in the future, and I bet you it will be cheaper then than it is now. And Paul Ehrlich, I don't know if you've heard of him, he was this famous doomsayer ecologist who said we're all going to starve to death, because he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. So he and another scientist, John Ehrlich, who later became President Obama's science advisor, they picked 5 metals, tin and copper and I think zinc, and they picked 10 years later in 1990, and sure enough, everything was cheaper, because copper, people used to think in the 1940s, they said, we're going to run out of copper.
But if we were going to run out, it was going to become more expensive, right?
It gets more expensive. And so people,
Because
they either look and they find new supplies, or they find substitutes. People in the 1940s were saying, we're going to run out. There'll be wars over tin because we won't have any cans anymore to put our food in. Well, nobody uses, tin can. Now we use, plastic bags and other things. People think we need all this copper for telephone wires. Well, we have wireless phones now. We don't need that copper wire anymore. So that's why these things happen. And then people also had the idea, aside from the fact that we're going to run out of all this stuff, so we have to save it all, that there's no place to bury it anymore. And if you thought about it for, about the numbers at all, this never made any sense. That if you took all the garbage that Americans will generate for the next 1,000 years, and if you think of the United States as a football field or a soccer pitch for your international audience, if you think of all the open land we have now, all the garbage that we generate in the next 1,000 years would fit in about 1 inch of that field. You basically just put it in a landfill, you cover it up, it becomes a park or a golf course or something. There's plenty of room to bury this.
So you think that it's not worth it at all to recycle anything?
Well, there are some things that it makes sense to recycle. And, before the whole recycling movement began, there was recycling going. People would recycle metals. Some, aluminum cans, for instance. It can be profitable because it takes a lot of energy to make aluminum. So if you take an aluminum can and you reprocess it, it saves energy and it saves money if it's done well. But we don't throw away cars when we're done with them. We sell them to someone. They get reused. So people have always recycled things. And in very poor countries, you have the poorest people going through, junkyards, picking out stuff, doing that. So, it does make sense to recycle some things. But the whole movement began, we have to save everything. And it never made any sense to recycle.
I had one girlfriend that was, she had zero waste. Mm-hmm. So she was, even when she was doing fruits or something, she was putting all the banana things on the freezer, on the freezer, and she was like throwing them in the fields for the plants, and she was really tried to have zero waste, and that was like a big kind of burden in her life as well.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, everything I have to collect everything, take it, my rubbish at home, and like find ways to use them or whatever. So you think she did it pointlessly?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a religion, and for many people, for really devout Greens, it's like a sacrament in their religion. We're doing, and if it makes you feel good, do it. But it's not. I mean, one thing I try to say to people is all this stuff, it came out of the ground. So why not just put it back in the ground? We don't.
So you believe that our energy. We can't do that, but our energy is more efficient spent elsewhere.
Yes, and our money. I mean, for instance, New York City, when it started the recycling program in about 1990, it expected that it was going to save money doing this. That it was going to save a lot of money every year because we'll get this stuff, and instead of paying to put it in a landfill, we'll sell it and we'll get so much money. Well, in fact, it costs much more money to recycle it, than it would to put in a landfill. And I think it's something like you could save hundreds of millions of dollars every year if it just put stuff in a landfill. And that money could go for schools, for parks, for other things.
What is to burn them? This is the solution, to burn them, not to throw them, not to to burn them. This is the.
Well, you can burn them. I mean, in Northern European countries, they have very clean incinerators that turn waste into energy, and they have very few pollutants at all. And that can make sense. The cheapest thing, especially in the United States, is just to put it in a landfill and cover it up. So
like put it underground and cover it up.
And then it turns into a park afterwards. Where the U.S. Open Tennis Championship is played, that's an old landfill. And today the landfills have these very strict environmentals. They have linings. They're monitored. The stuff doesn't leak. It just sits there.
Okay, and after years, it becomes one with the ground.
Well, it just sits there. It's like, I mean, it all came out of the ground, and now it's, for instance, I mean, all the plastic bottles that you have, that was probably natural gas or oil, that was in the ground, and now you put it back in. And people, now people say, well, recycling is good because it reduces carbon emissions, and that's good for climate change. But it's such an inefficient way to do it. I mean, one example, I did a follow-up article for the New York Times several years ago, and we looked at that, one plastic bottle that you get, that if you wanted to make up for the carbon that you use for the one passenger taking a round trip to Europe from New York to London, say, if you wanted to offset that carbon emission, you would have to recycle, I think it was 40,000 plastic bottles.
Okay.
So it's a minuscule thing. And if you actually rinse that plastic, they tell you that you should rinse your recyclables when you do it. If you use hot water to rinse that, you actually are putting more carbon in the atmosphere because you had to have electricity to make that hot water, or you had to have.
Interesting. So I have a question about there is a lot of people trying to do self-help and motivation and all this stuff, which I don't really I agree with, like to just force everybody to motivate them to. But in this book, I feel like your ideas, I feel they're more scientific stuff about willpower. So I don't feel this motivational guru thing of like how do you make the distinction of this? And did you think about this topic before?
Well, I've thought a lot about self-help books. In fact, a friend of mine and I, Christopher Buckley, who's a very funny comic novelist, he and I wrote a comic novel called God is My Broker. The subtitle was The 7.5 Laws of Spiritual and Financial Growth. And it was making fun of the whole like Deepak Chopra and Anthony Robbins. And it was all making fun of these self-help people because, they're peddling. It's like a religion. You're just peddling stuff. I mean, for the books, for the Power of Bad and for Willpower, the advice is all based on pretty good scientific studies, that they've with a control group, and they test something and they see, does it work, what works, what doesn't. And so we try to constantly see, has this actually been proven to make any difference? And, my co-author, Roy Baumeister, he's really one of the best known, most quoted, most cited social psychologists in the world. And what I love about him, he's a real scientist, in that he's always willing to be contradicted. If somebody says, objects to, oh, great, well, let's hear the objection. Maybe I was wrong. Let's find a better answer. And that's what science is all about. And that's what, and the problem during the pandemic, people said, we're following the science, as if science is one thing, that is one set of one dogma that you believe forever. No, it always changes. You have to, pay attention to the facts.
So this is how you kind of escape of this guru thing, is like use the science method, and like to approach this in the science way, not like, oh, do these 3 things to change your life.
Right,
but it actually this can do this for you, can help you improve your life, and can help you, but in a lot more polite and beautiful way. That this is step 1, step 2, step.
Right, we have a lot of tips. Do this, do that. We have like advice for couples in the Power of Bad about what. Here's a list of things couples can do to minimize the bad things and accentuate the positive. So.
Yeah, but with saying all the science
stuff.
It's all which this is what people miss in their self-help books.
Right. No, they've done a lot. I mean, there've been all these studies that friends with couples, tracking couples over a long time and seeing which couples get divorced, which ones don't. How do they behave? How do they do that? And with the willpower things, what actually, when do people actually have more self-control? Well, how do they structure their lives?
So let's dive in a bit about your professional life, how everything evolved, and like how did you make money when you were younger? What stuff? How did it evolve now when you are older? And what are you passionate about? So tell me about, explain your professional life, how it went.
I guess when I was younger, I wanted to be a mathematician, and then I went to college. I went to Yale, and I took an advanced math class freshman year, and realized I'm not meant to be a mathematician.
Okay.
I was really in over my head, and I ended up, and I took a writing course from a writer named William Zinsser. He has a great book called On Writing Well. That was really the course he taught at Yale, and it was just how to do it. And I worked for the school newspaper, and I edited a magazine there. And then I was desperate to get summer jobs, and so I was getting internships at newspapers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where I grew up, and in Minneapolis.
At what age? Now we're talking about 24, 25?
No, this is like 19, 20, 21. In the summer when I was at the university, I would get a summer job at a newspaper. And then when I graduated, I went to work for a newspaper in New Jersey. Then I went to work for a newspaper in Washington, D.C. Then I became a freelance writer. I wrote for all kinds of magazines, Rolling Stone.
And they were paying you to write there. Yes. Was it in the beginning good money, or just barely for you to survive?
It was decent money, because I would have a contract. Freelance writing is a difficult thing, but I would have contracts with magazines. I would be a contributing editor, and they would they would pay me, and it was enough to live on. And then in 1990, when I was, I guess in my late 30s, I got a job at the New York Times, and I worked there for more than 20 years, and I wrote. How many stuff you were reading, having stuff on the writing stuff 2-3 times a week or every day? Like, how often did you publish? It depended. Part of the time I wrote for the magazine, the Sunday magazine. There would be long articles, but I wrote but I spent, I guess, more of the time writing columns, and the columns would be I wrote a column about New York City called The Big City was the name of the column, and that was twice a week. And then I wrote an op-ed column on the op-ed page. That was twice a week.
So this is how you learn how to write, by writing in all these.
Well, but I learned. I was for many years before the New York Times, I was always writing. Yeah, and then I wrote a science column. That was the longest thing I wrote at the New York Times. So,
So you were always kind of in love with science and this scientific method, or late in life you became
I was always interested as a kid. I loved mathematics and I liked science. And my father was a professor, a university professor at the University of Pittsburgh in chemical engineering, and I thought it'd be a good life to be a professor. But I realized when I got to college, I think that I didn't that to go into one field so strongly. I'm too much of a dilettante for that. I like
what dilettante.
A dilettante is someone who just dabbles in one thing and another instead of being a real specialist.
Okay.
That I just didn't want to delve that deeply into one area. I like doing lots of things, and so journalism is perfect. It's very shallow. I've had to dig in deeply into subjects like for the negativity effect, for the power of bad, but I get to write about other things too. And I just kind of fell into journalism that way. And then I was at the New York Times for 20 years, and then I started doing books, these books, and also and I now write for the City Journal.
So with these books, how long each book took you to write and to make these books? How long?
Boy, I'm trying to. I guess several years,
And you are the person that wrote it?
I wrote it with Roy Baumeister, and we wrote them together, So, he would supply...
How does that work? Like, you write half of the book, you write together each page, and one person reviews the other?
It was basically... Roy's a very good writer, but he would basically write up the scientific part of it, and then I would look for... kind of ways to illustrate the science, stories about people like David Blaine to illustrate willpower.
Yeah.
And then I would put it all together and write it. And then he would look over what I wrote and we would go back and forth. But it was really, we had a great time doing it. We never had any fights about it all.
And it solved a lot of copies. So like, how does that, when you have a co-writer on a book, like how does that work with the money? You split the money? Like how does that work?
Yeah, generally you just split the money, yeah. Sometimes if one person...
And you did it with a publisher, or you published your...
Oh, no, our publisher. We had, publishers, Penguin Press published both books.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so those books were profitable?
They've been translated into 24 languages. We made the New York Times bestseller list, and right back here I've got a whole bunch of these foreign editions of it.
Oh, that's fine. Chinese,
yes, and, Estonian, all these languages. So it's been nice to see that.
And what was the opportunities that these books brought to you? Because I guess with a successful book, like a lot of things come together, like opportunity for you to talk or to conferences, or like to collaborate with bigger names, or to learn. Did that help at all?
Yeah, I would give speeches about this, and so giving speeches. But my main thing is writing. I really.
So this is what you spend your whole day doing, writing stuff,
right? And I'm writing. I'm always writing about something new that's that's going on. This has been really helpful, and I'll write about new developments in these fields. But I'm the last couple of years I've been writing a lot about COVID, but now I'm writing about. I'll probably start writing. I'll move on to other subjects now, but I'm very concerned with COVID about that we don't learn the right lessons from it. That we made these solutions that made things
we don't
worse.
Understand what to,
and the people that made all the mistakes are not apologizing. They're not. I'm really scared that we're going to do even worse next time. That that they'll, now people are talking about we should all wear masks during flu season, and you mentioned, I just had an article out about masks, about this really the best study yet, the most rigorous study of all the masks, shows that they didn't make any difference in COVID. There's no evidence that they made any difference.
So, but now you in the city where you publish?
It's called City Journal, and it's cityjournal.org.
Okay, we're going to put the link in the description. Also, we're going to put the link of the books in the description. And do you have audiobooks for
yes.
for the?
I saw
that as well.
too.
So I'm going to start because I have to not eat food for 30 days. That's one of my next videos, and I have to be buried alive for 10 days.
How do you feel about that?
I'm excited, but I will read the Willpower book. Maybe it will help me get through all those. So thank you. It was a pleasure to sit with you and learn from you. And I'm looking forward for the future with optimism.
Well, thank you. It's been great talking to you, and I really wish you good luck with the project.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you for watching.